Everyone will start. So, bonjour tout le monde. Je suis Pamela Isfeld, la présidente de la PASE, et je suis ici avec Eduardo Del Buey, who has written a wonderful memoir on his diplomatic life. And so, I just want to start off by reminding everyone, um, I am chairing this meeting from the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people and acknowledge and respect them as the past, present, and future guardians and caretakers of these lands. And I know I can see from the participants list that people are joining us from all over. So I just encourage everyone to take a moment and think about the traditional peoples of the lands that you are on, and what those relationships mean for the lives that we all live today. Um, Eduardo is has had an extremely interesting career at then external and foreign affairs, and at the UN, and the Commonwealth and a few different places. So, starting, you joined in 1974, right, Eduardo? Have I got that date right?
May 14th, 1974.
Wow. Well, and when was your last day?
My
2011?
last day was 2011.
Okay, so you've been observing us with a little bit of distance and perspective for a while, and had time to think about your diplomatic life and career. Um, I'm not going to do a big introduction because we want to hear from you about your book and your experiences. But could I just ask you why you've written other books? I know. I sent the link around with the invitation to the webinar where people can find your books on Amazon. Why a memoir and why now? What was the impetus for writing the book, this
Well,
particular one?
the memoir begins with my dad. Before he passed away, he wrote a book called De Tangier à Montréal, From Tangiers to Montreal, where he recorded his own childhood and adolescent life, his move from Madrid to Tangiers, where he met my mom, their move to Canada, where they married and had us kids, and their lives in Montreal as they developed their marriage and their kids, and watched us all grow up, and where they became assimilated Canadians, very much so. They loved Canada, and that was their home. They never talked about going back to the old country. They were both perfectly trilingual, English, French, and Spanish. And my dad challenged me after he wrote the book. He said, "Well, you've got to write one too, given your background and given the interesting life you've had. And if there's one reason I'm glad I wrote the book is because you have been kind enough to invite me to address PAFSO members who are the next generation of what I came in as in 1974, foreign service officers who are beginning or in mid-career, most of them as PAFSO members. And it gives me an opportunity to connect with them, and it gives them an opportunity to pick the brains of somebody who's been around the track a few times. So thank you so much for the invitation. And the product of that promise I made to my dad was a diplomatic life. And it's called a diplomatic life because diplomacy has been part of my life, but not my whole life. And I believe that a life is composed of your physical, professional, spiritual, emotional, creative parts that make you as a human being, a holistic human being. And diplomacy opened the door to a lot of things. My childhood opened the door to a lot of things. And I felt I wanted to share that with my family. And then I shared it with a couple of friends, and an old friend of mine, colleague of mine, Doug Gardner, read it and said, "You've got to publish it because people, young foreign service officers, have to know what it's all about." And so between him and other members of my family and friend group, I decided to publish it. And that's the result, is a book that's available now on Amazon. And
Yeah.
just for political correctness, it's in French, English, and Spanish
Wow. Wow.
on
That's a big
Amazon.
wow. That, I mean, that's just publishing a book, and especially in three languages, is a huge accomplishment. I'm a aspiring crime fiction author for my sins, and have been investigating, all these different ways of getting published, and it's a lot of work, right? It's not
It's
a
a lot of work and a lot of luck. I've had three books published by a major Spanish publisher, my three books in Spanish, and they were done. The books I'm publishing right now, it's a self-publishing system with Amazon. But today I signed a contract with Atlantic Books, a major Spanish publication company, to publish my latest book, a one-man search in Spanish.
Oh,
So it's going to be. I want to see if they have an English publisher that can do it also, and get into a more professional aspect of it. But with Amazon, it went very well. I designed the cover, I designed the book. I had my family and friends help me proofread it and get the facts right. And it was a really enjoyable process for two reasons. One, to give my dad the satisfaction that his son lived through his promise. And the second one was to be able to relive 73 years of life as though it were a movie in front of me at this particular time. And that made all the difference in the world. And it's enriched my life. And I hope that my book enriches the lives of others.
well, and that really comes across in your book, that you get that sense of vividness, that you're there with you, in the experience. I mean, it's nice to read a book that is not, I mean, this is not very kind of me, but sometimes I read memoirs and I'm like, oh, is this another memoir of a prairie boyhood? It's it's a I mean, sometimes you're thinking, who is this written for? Is this written for an audience? Is this written to tell people about what happened, or is this written, should this have been a diary entry?
Right, right, right. Well, I want to make it as interesting as possible, mixing all the aspects of my life. And the main message was that you're a professional, you're creative, you're emotional, you're spiritual, you're physical, and that all of these aspects have to be taken into account. And diplomacy has offered me an absolutely marvelous framework within which to develop all of those facets of my life. And I think it's something that we have to be grateful for, that the Department of Foreign Affairs and the diplomatic service offers you, is a chance to explore the universe in the broadest sense.
Yes, yes, for sure. I mean, there are some experiences that you are only going to have as a diplomat serving your
Mm-hmm.
country, you know? There's lots of, I mean, nowadays there's a lot of interesting ways to work internationally, if that's what people want. But if you want some of these certain experiences, this is the only game in town, really. So maybe I could ask you, I mean, you've got a lot of anecdotes in your book, and several different stories about, interesting things. What is your favorite anecdote from your book? I mean, what was, tell us about one of your experiences that really stands out as something special about being a Canadian diplomat abroad. Or
Well, one of the things
maybe
that
not.
really stands out, and I only do it in about a paragraph of the book. In 1994, I was departmental spokesperson for Latin America, Caribbean, and Africa. And I was also the late Christine Stewart spokesperson. She was Secretary of State for these regions. And we had the honor and pleasure of going to South Africa for the elections. The first elections after apartheid, and the first elections in which Black South Africans were allowed to participate fully and won the election. And we took the ambassador's car with the ambassador driver, because we were doing the observation of different different voting stations. And we went to one polling station, which was in the district where the ambassador's driver came from. And he walked into the polling station to vote, and he came out with tears in his eyes. And we said, "What's the matter?" He said, "For the first time in my life, I'm a human being in my own country."
Wow.
I said, "Wow, to be able to be a witness to that and to work for a diplomatic service that worked so hard to get rid of apartheid under John Diefenbaker, under Brian Mulroney especially, it was just wonderful. It was a wonderful experience." And I said, "Only in the Foreign Service."
It's true, hey? You would not have access to that kind of thing really anywhere else. Maybe I could just ask, just turning just a little bit, you worked for a couple of international organizations, the UN, the
Yes.
Commonwealth. What was the difference between working in a with a group, an organization like that, and the experience of how things were done? In terms of life things, but also in terms of, office, career experience things, that
Mm-hmm.
between those organizations and, being posted working for external, what was then external affairs, I guess.
Well, when you're working for Global Affairs Canada or External Affairs, we've gone through so many iterations and so many baptisms. You're working for one country. You're working for a set of policies and a set of objectives that are very well defined, and you have your marching papers, and you know how to advocate for them, you know how to lobby for them, you know how to sell them, and you know how to negotiate them in order to get the best benefit for Canada and for the other side also. I mean, it's not a zero-sum game. You want the best for everybody. When you're working for an international organization, it's very different. When you're part of the bureaucracy, as I was with the secretariats of all three organizations, in the OAS, we had 34 member states at that time. They make policy. The Secretariat executes policy. And I was director of media relations for two of the organizations. And when people used to walk up to me and say, "Why doesn't the OAS do something about Nicaragua? Or why doesn't the OAS do something about Syria?" I say, "Because we don't have the mandate to do it. The mandate comes from the member states. And if they don't have a consensus, we don't get any mandate. So you have to talk to the member states and get them to explain to you why this is not happening." So the fundamental difference is that you're with the international organization, you have to be able to distill what the various country member states are doing, and they have to be in a position to tell them, "Look, the media is looking for this," and then it's up to their governments to decide whether they come to a consensus or not. And unfortunately, in most major cases, they didn't come to consensus. As you see now, the way the world is today, the UN has lost its bite, the OAS has lost its bite, and the Commonwealth has lost its bite. And there's no consensus between the countries because they're divided between different power groups and different interests, geopolitical interests.
And divided internally in many cases as well, right? So
Very much so.
can't
And
even
the other thing, of course, is that people who work for the secretariats come from different countries. Canada never influenced me in my work. As far as Canada was concerned, I was an international civil servant, and that's the way I was. But other countries had a vested interest in the employees who worked for the organization, and they became internal advocates for what the home country was doing because in their say they didn't have the freedoms that we have in Canada. And if you disagree, you lose your job, you lose your head, and you lose everything else. So it was very difficult also to get consensus sometimes within the organization.
Yeah, yeah. Do you have any advice for diplomats who are assigned to the multilateral missions, dealing with these organizations on how they could either, well, I was initially thinking, make things easier for, their people who are working in the secretariats, but also, best engage with people who are working for international organizations like you did. I'm coming from a little bit, I have a little bit of an idea in the back of my head on this because I did this myself a couple times. I
Hmm.
was political advisor at the Office of the High Representative in Bosnia when Wolfgang Petritsch and then Lord Ashdown were the High
Right,
Representative.
right.
And that was an international secretariat pulled together with contributions from the G7 and Russia. So that was interesting. And then I was twice, I was the NATO political advisor to the deputy commander in Kabul and then to the commander of RC South in Canada.
Wow.
Yeah, those were really interesting. But it is that, you are, I mean, I was on a loan basically. It
Hmm.
was not quite the same. I was not an international civil servant, but I was a loan to these organizations and had to represent, the organization. And I was always very grateful that Canada did not put a lot of pressure on me, although in with my NATO assignments, I was reporting to a Canadian general in all cases, but in his role as commander, as multinational
Right.
commander. But sometimes there were moments sometimes where I wanted to give advice to our people about, hey, you are wanting something to happen here, and your approach, you might. I could give you some tips on how to approach. Sometimes they were interested in hearing from me, and sometimes not. Um, but I kind of felt sometimes that there were some wasted opportunities in those areas just because our folks did not always understand some of the tensions that were there in that kind of a job. I mean, I was not a spokesperson, I was an advisor internally, but yeah.
Well, you have to, as an international civil servant, you have to ensure that you're not seen as working for your home country. You have to. I remember when I was being interviewed by Don McKinnon, the Secretary General of the Commonwealth. He told me, "Tell me something about your time at the OAS." So I said, "Well, look, at the OAS, I went there and I tried to create an internal management system that resembled more the Canadian management system." And he said, "Well, that's not the kind of thing you should be telling me as the head of an international organization." I said, "Yes, but the trouble was that the Secretary General Gaviria wanted to change the system to a more Western, liberal, highly developed democratic system and not the bureaucracy he faced. And my job was to help him do that in the communication field." And he said, "Oh, okay, no, that's fine, that's fine." And I said, "Yeah, no, no, my job is not to cater to the Canadian government, but and at that time we had the most amazing Canadian ambassador to the OAS, Peter Bean, who really did not need any advice, although he welcomed support from all quarters and he was a great consensus builder, he still is. But I said, I used to tell people that you're doing this the wrong way. Yeah, but my government wants this, but your government doesn't understand the sensitivities of that government or of that position. But they didn't cotton on because most governments don't want to go to a place like the OAS or the UN to listen. They want to go there to dictate and maximize their own foreign policy positions. And that really works counter to the consensus building need for an organization because the organization does not work by majority vote, it works by consensus. And that's the problem. If you don't achieve consensus, you don't get anywhere. If you were working for an organization where you had a majority vote, chances are many in the minority would leave. So you'd rather have them inside the tent rather than outside the tent.
Yeah, yeah. My first posting was in Nairobi, and we were the delegation to the UN Environment Program and
Mm-hmm.
Habitat there, and we saw that happening quite a lot. Every so often there would be somebody who would just try to just bulldoze and force a consensus. And sometimes they would, sometimes they would get everybody else to back down, but then they just would not implement the consensus, or they would just stop participating. Um, and yeah, it's not easy. Do you think that it's getting better, worse? I mean, I know you've been out of the game for a while, but I know you watch things. How do you think in general the skill level of our diplomacy is these days? I mean, do you think that Canadian foreign service officers, Canadian diplomacy is, you know, keeping up the standards that were set, or do you think there are things that we should be doing differently? I'm putting on my PAFSO hat again, thinking, we're the professional
Okay.
association for foreign service officers, and we're always thinking about training and professional development and things like that we could offer our folks. This is part of, this kind of conversation is part of what we do. But I would welcome your advice on, what you think we could, if you think there are any areas that are getting missed in the official stuff these days.
Well, I think so, yes. So in conversations I've had with former colleagues of mine, many of us come to the conclusion that if we were competing for jobs in foreign affairs today, we wouldn't pass. The issues are so much more complex today than they were when I joined. I mean, when I joined, there was the Soviet Union, the United States, and the Third World. Those were the three poles, and you knew which way things were balanced. You knew how the Soviets were going to respond. You knew how the Group of 77 was going to respond. You knew how the West was going to respond. Nowadays, with the different blocks that are emerging, and blocks, I mean India, China, people, the Africans are trying to create their own bloc, the BRICS, Russia with its attempts to create organizations with the Central Asian states and with other dictatorships. It's a more complex world, and technology has made it much more complex. I mean, today the prime minister or president of the country can say what he wants to do, but one guy with his finger on the market, a little button on his computer, and artificial intelligence can push that button and completely change the economic equation around the world. Secondly, in a country like Canada, you have to decide whether you're going to be international or you're going to be satisfying just your own personal requirements. Now, if you take a look at what's happening in the debate in Canada, for example, you've got people who are ultra-nationalists who just want to be there for the benefit of Canadians. Others who are internationalists who want Canada to be there for the international community, those who oppose foreign aid, those who want foreign aid, those who want global trade, those who don't want global trade. And the government has to lead not by consensus, because you're never going to get consensus from them. It has to lead by where it thinks is the right direction to go. And diplomats have to know what direction it's going to go. But diplomats also have to realize that some of the opposition they're going to face is going to come from home. So we have to be highly sensitive to the internal Canadian situation so that we can advise, because part of our job being overseas is to advise the government. How is our policy playing in Zimbabwe? How's it playing in Venezuela? How's it playing in Brazil? And that's part of our job. And the government has to realize that it has all of these antennae out there who are brilliant people and who can contribute something to domestic policy making in terms of foreign policy that may not hit them in between the eyes when they first glance at it.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, I think one of the major things I face is language training. When I went to Iran, pre-revolutionary Iran, which is the most fantastic posting, the Shah's Iran was fascinating, wonderful, but none of us spoke Farsi. So we could be walking in front of a mosque where Khomeini's speeches were calling on people to kill everybody that wasn't like them, and we just think it was a regular prayer session. So you have to have people who can speak, not only speak the language, but people who are sensitive to the local culture. Because part of our job as political antennae is to be able to reflect the social realities of the country so that Canadians can advise business people, can advise political leaders, can advise academics as to what the reality is and how we progress to make good decisions and good policies with respect to that country.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it was Bismarck who said that, a diplomat's job is not just to represent their home country to their host country. It's also to represent their host country to a certain extent back to their home country and, what the concerns are and how issues are landing and so on. I feel personally sometimes what I see, what I saw in my last few years, I've been doing this PAFSO thing full time since 2019, but my last job was Deputy Director of Foreign Policy Research. And
Mm-hmm.
it was mostly internal, it was mostly supposed to be, engaging with universities and think tanks and so on in Canada. And what I found was that they didn't always want to hear from us.
Mm-hmm.
That decision makers did not always want to get that input from someone saying, what you're saying is just not landing. It's
Mm-hmm.
just not it doesn't align with the realities here. Maybe we can, you know, can we tweak the message a little bit to make it more, so that the lock, the key might fit the lock a little bit. And they did not want to hear that. Like,
Well, that happens. That happens everywhere. Uh, People have a set mentality. Everyone comes with a past, and everyone comes to the present. That's their reality. If somebody comes along and challenges the reality, the person has to be mature enough to listen to the challenge and be willing to say, "Well, maybe you're right." But unfortunately, we all have egos, and very often the ego overcomes intuition. And even though we may feel the other person is right, our ego won't let us say so. And that happens in foreign policy. This is my line. This is my ideology. This is a government's ideology, and we can't go against it. And that's what hinders a lot of progress. That's what hinders a lot of development, which is why things don't develop quickly. They tend to bang into walls all the time. And we see that in foreign policy. We don't understand what the reality is, and we don't understand how we can deal with the reality because we all have our own fixed positions that are like almost set in concrete, like concrete bunkers. And we find it very difficult to come out of those bunkers into the daylight and say, okay, let's sit down and let's look at what your reality, what my reality is, and see if we can come up to a definition of reality.
and what do you think is the best way of breaking through some of that? I mean, I noticed through your book, you mention often like events and like cultural sort of diplomacy, bringing art to different places, hosting dinners and things like that. I mean, I feel like that is always the first thing that gets cut. Whenever anybody is looking to save money, it's like, oh well, we're not going to do any of that. We're going to cut your events. You're not allowed to have a reception. But for me personally, I mean, right now for PAFSO, I have a small budget and I take people for lunches and things the way,
Mm-hmm.
we used to do at Post. And
Right.
honestly, it is one of my biggest tools, because people love to sit down over a meal. There's all kinds of neuroscience that shows that when we sit down and we consume food with somebody as primates, our brains go into a different frame. Like I went gorilla watching when I was on my posting in Africa, and one of the things they told us was that if a gorilla comes up and starts staring at you, the thing to do is grab a leaf from the nearest bush, pretend to eat it, and offer some to the gorilla. because it
Hmm.
immediately tells the gorilla that, you're there as a friend, you're not there to fight, you're willing to share. And they said most of the time that will immediately de-escalate the situation. So there's all kinds of reasons that it's a good idea to do this, and yet it's the first thing that seems to go. I
Well, I'll give you an example from my professional life. I was posted to Mexico, 95 to 99. I arrived in Mexico a year after the Chiapas uprising, and Canada was very worried about whom we had gone into bed with in terms of NAFTA. It was not a country like the United States, like Canada. They had human rights problems, indigenous problems, and Canada wanted to do something to bring the message of democracy and human rights to Mexico. There was a program I discovered when I got to Spain that we had, which was the Association of Canadian Studies. In Spain, we had the Spanish Association of Canadian Studies, which was we would give academics from a broad range of academia bursaries to study in Canada for 6 weeks and integrate what they learned about Canada into their courses. When I got to Mexico, I found we had an extremely brilliant group of people in the Mexican Association of Canadian Studies who were advocates for Canada. So what I decided to do, and the ambassador blessed it, was to create a conference program of 8 weeks of conferences, 3 times a week, on issues like democracy, women's rights, indigenous rights, voting, free trade, all of these things. But the ambassador first said, well, yeah, well, you're going to get yourself kicked out of the country for as a diplomat, you can't interfere in the internal affairs of Mexico. I said, we have a secret weapon. We have 2,000 Mexican academics who know Canada and who know what Canada's policies are and what Canada needs and who agree with what Canada wants to do. So we populated these conferences with Mexican academics speaking to Mexicans. We had senior politicians, media, all kinds of people coming to the embassy for the conferences, and the Mexican Foreign Ministry never once complained about them. So we had, and then the government in 2012 cut that program as a budget cutting exercise. And to me, that was the most powerful tool Canadian diplomats had to create soft diplomacy.
Yeah.
And they cut it. And I don't think they've rebuilt it.
No, I think they did. I think it was they got a little bit of funding back, but no, same when I went to Warsaw in 2012, I was shocked to find how many they called them the Canadianists. How
Mm-hmm.
many of them there were in all different parts of program of Poland, like far from the capital, in areas dealing with all kinds of different border issues and so on. And I was really surprised at how committed people were and how much they knew about Canada, how deeply they
Exactly.
had studied things, how welcoming they were. So we kind of in the embassy, we kind of found a way under the radar to keep the ties going and try to,
Mm-hmm.
do to engage with them when we could. And again, that was when my hospitality budget came into play because we would say, well, we can't sponsor your conference, but do you want to have a reception? We
Mm-hmm.
could host a reception for you. We could host the welcome reception or something, and not call it that we were giving money to the Canadian Studies program. But you should not have to do that kind of thing under the radar. I don't understand why this is so hard, why this is such a tough message to get to decision makers about how important it is. Because those of us
Because
who've been in the
decision,
field
decision
know.
makers are elected. Decision makers are elected. And if you ask the average Canadian what do diplomats do, well, they have receptions, they get all dressed up in fancy clothes, they go out to fancy dinners. My first diplomatic posting, I used to go to jails and morgues. And
Yes.
I used to tell my friends, this is not exactly the diplomacy you think we're practicing. What I did, I wrote a book a few years ago that's available on Amazon called Public Diplomacy, where I advocate for public diplomacy. I think it's the most important tool in any diplomat's, any foreign ministry's toolkit. And it is the first thing to go. It's soft power, as Professor Joseph Nye used to say, and it's the kind of power that sways people. It creates empathy for your country. It creates understanding. And I'll give you another example. I used to be a songwriter. And in Peru in 1985, I wrote a song called Somos Peru in Spanish. And I told the ambassador, and he got a kick out of it. The head of the major radio station at the time came to see me, and I talked to him about it. And he said, "Well, if you write the song, we'll produce it." And Ambassador Keith Bezanson, who was a marvelous person, said, "Well, they produced it. The embassy is going to back you fully with 3,000 records." So I wrote the song, we produced it. And the funny thing was that the Peruvian flag is like the Canadian flag, except instead of having the maple leaf in the center, it has the coat of arms in the center. So every time I went on the radio, they'd say, "Here comes a representative of a country that has almost a similar flag to us and has a wonderful message for us called Somos Peru." And all of a sudden, Peruvians in the street who always ask themselves, what do Canadians do? I was on the rock channels every night. And all of a sudden, they knew that Canada was funding this record of a song that was written for Peruvian children along the lines of We Are the World. And that really made a difference. It opened up the doors to a lot of people for me in terms of getting to meet foreign ministers, in terms of getting to meet government ministers. And the people just responded because it was a different way of doing diplomacy in 1985. So we have all of these potential tools that we throw away come budget time, and it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I mean, it to me it doesn't make any sense, especially now that we're hearing the official position that we need to, increase our ties out, stop relying on one big relationship so much.
Mhm.
And yet, the Foreign Service, our representation abroad is facing these major cuts. I mean, I it doesn't add up as far as I can tell, and we will be pushing back as much as we can. It's hard when you know the economy is in a situation that we do have to recognize. But honestly, I think that there are places where things can be trimmed, and there are places where they definitely should not be. And seems to me that some of the targeting is not is should could be refined a little bit, shall we say?
Well, you have to have people who are doing the trimming who know the value of what they're getting rid of.
Hmm.
You have a lot of people like me who are retired. People like John Graham, who was a founder of the Canadian Academic Relations Division and the work there. And nobody ever consults with us. There's a tremendous font of retired FSs and retired EXs who are just out there doing their own thing, but they're not
Yeah.
consulted. There's no consultative group. Maybe once or twice a year, have a Zoom meeting where we give our reactions, having worked and not being afraid of losing our jobs because we don't have them anymore, that we can be blunt and say, this is where you guys are going wrong based on 40 years of experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one of the things that I feel, and it's been something that I've been turning over in my head ever since I joined the Foreign Service, and certainly since I got involved with PAFSO, is I feel like we need to do a better job of establishing the skills of diplomacy, the skills of being a Foreign Service officer as an area of specialization in itself. It's not something everybody can do. And
No.
that ability to network and to build rapport with different people, all of those kinds of things. I mean, I hear sometimes people saying, "Well, we need more specialized knowledge in foreign affairs." Sure. I mean, you can always use people who can speak, specific languages at a very high level, who have, knowledge of different countries, different economies,
Mhm.
all of those things. But to me, the core skills of a diplomat we need to figure out a way of packaging that, presenting that in a way that says, you think that going to a reception may not is a waste of time and that person is just getting a free drink and having some fun. But a diplomat, a skilled diplomat going to a reception, that person is doing something, working something, getting something that is not the same as, your average person just walking into a room and grabbing a glass of wine from the waiter.
It's called working the room. When I was teaching strategic communications at the universities in Mexico, where I lived for 7 years after retiring, I used to give the anecdote that whenever I had to go to a diplomatic reception, I was taken there by a car and driver, an embassy driver. I always made sure our drivers had copies of our press releases and our talking points. Why? Because while we're inside trying to get the ear of the minister, they're outside having a cigarette and chatting with the minister's drivers.
Yeah.
So the first thing I used to do when I got back into the car was tell the driver, so what's happening? And they would tell me what the minister's driver said, what the other ambassador's driver said. And it was a wealth of intelligence that would have taken me weeks to get by knocking on people's doors and going to their offices. So it's what I call working the room. And a diplomat has to have the ability to work the room and to have the empathy to be able to get people to talk. And there's nothing that gets people talking more, especially macho people, than 3 or 4 drinks. There they want to prove to you that they know more than you do. And I used to, in Tehran, I don't drink. So when I had a cocktail party in Tehran, I used to go running to the bathroom with my little notebook and keep on writing notes and write my political reports based on what they were telling me. So these are things that we have to educate the Canadian public as to what diplomats do. And that's something that's very difficult because the media are always jealous of the perks we have, the allowances, the nice housing we have abroad. But we have to be able to educate the Canadian public that diplomacy is essential. But it's so esoteric. It's very difficult to talk to John Q. Public and tell him what kind of a job we're doing, how much work we're doing, and how it benefits Canada. We have to have professionals who can act as diplomats for the Canadian people to the Canadian Diplomatic Corps to be able to understand and generate knowledge of what our role is.
Hmm. Well, if you have any advice for me as president of PAFSO on what I could be doing, what we could be doing, one thing we're doing is we are working right now on a book. It's called Dip Notes, and it's basically we're taking some of our best articles from Buda Papier magazine, and then we're
Mm-hmm.
writing around them. Some of them, I mean, some of them were published, in the 70s and the 80s. So
Right.
we're writing around them to give context and so on.
Mm-hmm.
We're putting together, it's going to be a fairly hefty, there'll be a paper version that will be kind of like a coffee table book. And then the main effort is really going to be an ebook that we're going to kind of give to everyone who wants it. But it's to answer some of those questions about what do diplomats do? What is the life like? What are people doing when they're out on posting? Because one question we constantly get, and now we have your book that we can refer people to, is okay, I'm thinking I want to be a foreign service officer, but I don't really know what that is. I don't really know what is the daily life like. What is I see the ambassador to the UN on TV, but I
Mm-hmm.
know that, he's got 50 people working for him, so I'm probably going to be one of the 50 rather than the ambassador. What will I do? What will my job be? What will my life be like? And there hasn't really been anything, so
Yeah.
this is part of an effort to get some of that out. And we will have this, once it's done, we'll have it. We'll be able to update it periodically,
Mm-hmm.
with new articles and so on. So hopefully this will be a tool that we can use. We've launched a couple of videos. We have a couple of advocacy videos, Canadian, foreign service officers out there for you.
Hmm.
Working all the different ways people are working to promote Canadian business, to open, to access markets and so on. But can you think of anything else that we should be doing?
Well, I love your idea of promoting my book.
Yes.
I love your idea of the book, the foreign affairs book. I have a feeling if you really want to make a difference, you have to focus on results. What is the result of negotiations going on in terms of human rights in Geneva for Canadians? What is the results for John Q. Public? How is it going to affect your interaction with people? How's it going to affect the way Canadian police react? How's it going to react to the way Canadian military people work? How's it going to make your own lives, how you interact with your neighbor? Another negotiation that may be going on is financial in terms of drug money laundering. How is that going to affect you as a citizen? What does this mean? Getting rid of the cartels. I mean, the results that the Canadian voter does not know because they're hidden
Mhm.
in a mass of news that reaches them, but they're not itemized and they're not made personal to them, relevant to their lives. And that's a very important exercise that the global affairs needs to do is to make its day-to-day work relevant. Now, the consular, you do it well because people who need a passport, people who have a death in the family, they get consular assistance. Trade is good, you have statistics, but how do you measure the impact of, say, a cultural treaty at UNESCO? How does that enhance Canadian artists? How does that enhance Canadian bilingual and multilingual Canadians? How does that enhance Quebec or Ontario or Manitoba or British Columbia? How does it enhance these are the questions that people in foreign affairs have to be asking themselves and then say, what are the answers? And how do we package those answers so they touch something inside the audience?
My when I was interviewed and when I got hired for the Foreign Service, one of the questions that they had in the interview was a role play kind of thing, and I was supposed to be talking to a group of fisher people in Newfoundland about what does the Foreign Service do, and luckily I had happened to pick up the Globe and Mail that morning, and
Mm-hmm.
I saw news about an international fishing agreement being signed.
Mm-hmm.
So I was able to say, well, you see this agreement, it was signed, I can't remember where, I think, at the EU, something like that. And here is a concrete result. You will see this in terms of, fewer foreign fishing boats, or I can't remember the details, but I'm pretty sure that that was what got me hired.
Well,
That
it was the
moment.
Spanish overfishing of the nose and tail of Newfoundland's water because I was there in Madrid with the overfishing with the North Atlantic Fisheries Organization and how we were trying to negotiate everybody to come and block Spain and Portugal from overfishing our own waters. This is what I mean. That is a group of diplomats who are there, and we're having cocktail parties and dinners and receptions and we're traveling to Galicia, for example, into the Basque country in Spain. And these are the results. So when
Yeah,
you say this is what it cost us, and this is what the results are for the people of Newfoundland,
yeah.
there you're getting the message out. And if we could do that for everything we do, identify the constituencies in Canada that are going to benefit from it and package it. Have to have very, very good communications people who can package with empathy. And we have to have very, very good political masters who understand that their foreign policy is going to cost them votes. Not because people are looking for foreign policy in an election, but because many of the decisions that get taken politically that deal with the international, with our imports, to deal with our raw materials, to deal with this, are the product of good, proper diplomacy. And how do we translate that into people's pocketbooks?
Yeah, yeah, no, those are great questions. And I mean, my concern is like this is the kind of thing that the departments should be doing, you know,
Hmm.
immigration, global affairs. I mean, these are messages that they should be getting out. But I mean, I don't know if you've noticed. I know a lot of your career was spent as a spokesperson, and you wrote another book about what do you call it in your in this book? Spokespersoning,
Spokespersonery.
personery,
Spokespersonery,
exactly.
yes.
I mean, to me, do you think that still exists as an art in the Canadian government? I do not see.
I don't think it exists as an art because most ministers want their spokespersons to say what they think. They
Mhm,
don't want their spokespersons coming back and saying, well, if we did it this way, it might be better. If we change the policy this way, it might do it. Because policy is no longer made by the Canadian foreign minister. Much of it is made in the prime minister's office. And they're not the people who are employing the spokespersons. So you have a system where you're not getting feedback. And if you want to have a system that you learn from, you have to give and take. That's an
mhm,
action and an equal and opposite reaction. And the people taking that reaction back to you are the people in embassies abroad, are your spokespersons who are dealing with the media every day and who should be empowered to challenge a minister politely and always at the end of the day accepting the political decisions that are taken because the political decisions are up to our political leaders, but at least sensitize them to the terrain they're walking on and sensitize them to the storms that may appear because of their decision making on a certain issue.
mhm, mhm. Yes, I mean, I guess my where I just wonder if we've gotten so far from working that way that, are we going to be able to get back to that? I mean, we're so far along just transmit only that I don't know how we get back to being able to receive that feedback. And not just receive it, but actually do something about it, you know?
It takes changing the mentality of ministers. One thing I write in my book is when I went to work at the UN, I arrived there on a Friday afternoon, and on Monday morning, I was expected to brief the Secretary General on what was happening in the world and how it affected the UN. Ban Ki moon was a remarkable man. He still is. I have all the appreciation in the world for him. He sat down with me and said, I know it's your first day, but what do you see? So I gave him a rundown of what the foreign we used to go into work at 6 o'clock in the morning to view all the world's media, and I give him a report at 8:30. And I said, well, the media are saying this, that. And they said, what do you think we should do? I said, well, I really think we should do this, that, and that. And in front of me, he picked up the phone and started calling undersecretaries general to tell them my spokesperson thinks we should do this, that, and that. Get me something in writing. And I was scared. I said, my God, this guy actually listens. Not only does he listen, but he takes me seriously. I've got to be very careful with what I say and do and it wasn't a question of incompetence, very competent, but he was a man who had learned to trust his advisors and to understand that his advisors had access to information that he didn't have because he was sitting in the stratosphere. We're living in the atmosphere. And that to me was one of the wisest managers I've ever seen, always willing to listen and always willing to change his mind if he heard a better idea that was correct.
Excellent. Excellent. Yeah, it's every so often Patty Ashdown was like that as well. And
Mm-hmm.
when you run across somebody like that, it's gold, you know, both in
Respect
terms of
them. You respect them.
yes, yes. I mean, yeah, that's important is it's gold in terms of your personal experience, in your career, I think, but also in terms of getting the job done. Eduardo, I'm just looking. It's 9:59 by my clock, so we've kept you for an
Mm-hmm.
hour. I just wanted to invite our audience. Does anybody have any questions or comments that they'd like to make? You can use the Q&A box if you don't want to speak up, or you can put your hand up and I can I can make you a panelist so you can talk. Um, I'm just looking. I'm seeing a few people, or it looks like couple people have to go. I always tell people, we block it out for an hour, so you're not being rude if you leave at an hour. But if you want to
Hmm.
stay a little bit longer, sometimes those are the best chats. It's a
That's right.
Yes, but thank you so much for taking the time to do this, and I will be following up with you to see if we can maybe if we can pick your brain on a few other things because you've given me some great ideas for things that we could do for PAFSO. Maybe what I will do is I will say goodbye and we will stop the recording.
Okay. Well, before we start the recording, I want to thank you so much. It's been an absolutely delightful conversation. And I'm glad that somebody at Foreign Affairs is listening to me. I hope I haven't made your life too difficult. I hope the editors don't have to snip too much of it. But it's been
No,
an
no,
absolute
I
pleasure.
think we're good. This is great.
It's
I
been an
mean,
absolute pleasure.
thank you very much.